Welcome, welcome, everybody. Greg Peterson coming to you from the urban farm in the heart of Phoenix, Arizona. I'm really excited tonight that we have Brad Lancaster on the call. He's going to be talking about all things desert living, including mesquite. Brad is the author of the award-winning Rainwater Harvesting for Drylands and Beyond and the co-founder of DesertHarvesters.org. Since 1993, Brad has run a successful permaculture education, design, and consultation business focused on integrated regenerative approaches to landscape design, planning, and living. And part of this is to talk about mesquite, which we're going to be talking about. Just a little bit about mesquite. It's an abundant native food which grows in the desert Southwest, yet most people don't know that you can eat the pods, but you can't just munch on them off of a tree. So this event is brought to you by GrowPHX. You can find out about GrowPHX at growphx.com. It's a local collaborative business designed to bring cool events like this and infrastructure into the valley. And without further ado, welcome, Brad. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, good to be here. Good to spread the word.
Yay, yay. So I'm just going to turn it over to you, man, and let's go off to the races.
Awesome. Okay. So as you guys can probably see on the slide, this talk is going to be about rewilding, re-enlivening, and rehydrating through place-based food production and celebration. So I want to start off by asking, have you ever experienced a true living oasis? Now, when I say true living oasis, I don't mean something that's dependent on an extension cord for power or dependent on a pump to import resources. I'm talking about a natural oasis that is thriving just with what's naturally occurring in that place. However, people can have a role in it. The key with these true living oases is they don't take from anything or anyone else. Rather, they just give. So I'm wondering if any of you have experienced such a thing. And if you have, what was it like for you? And what did it enable for you, for others, for the place where it's located? And did you have a role in it? So think about those questions as we go through, and I want to give you a few examples. So one oasis is the natural ecology of the Sonoran Desert ecosystem. I don't consider the Sonoran Desert to be a true desert because we have two rainy seasons in both the winter and the summer. And as a result, we've got an incredible diversity of native plants. With over 400 of those native plants produce food. Yet the crazy thing is very few people are aware of more than a dozen of these food plants. So there's so much abundance out there. And then we can also look to some great locations such as Check Dam Canyon in the Tucson Mountains and many other areas throughout the Southwest where the Civil Conservation Corps or some of the Native Americans put in some, long ago, some passive water harvesting and soil harvesting strategies. So what we see here in this photo is there's a cowboy hat on top of a filter check dam in the Tucson Mountains. And the Tucson Mountains is a very hot, dry, rocky, small mountain range in Tucson on the west side. But yet, when you go to Check Dam Canyon, where these simple strategies were implemented, we have water that can flow months after a good rainy season. And we have springs where you don't have that anywhere else in the Tucson Mountains. And on the lower right, you can see me taking a nice dip in one of the natural pools that has been enhanced by some of this past work. And then let's look again to the native plants. So the saguaro cactus. So it's iconic to the area. But how many people have ever tasted the fruit? I mean, it is incredible. And I was very lucky to have the opportunity to go harvesting with Stella Tucker, who unfortunately passed away earlier this year, and with her daughter Tanisha, who carries on the traditional saguaro camp. And they are very generous in teaching others how you can harvest the saguaro fruit with the saguaro. So you're basically using the skeleton lashed together to create a pole with a creosote top bar on top from which you knock or pull down the fruit. And if the fruit's closed, you snap off the dried flower, which you use as a blade, the base of which you use as a blade to open up the skin, and then there's the juicy red pulp within. And when I first tried this fruit, it was mind-boggling to me because I grew up here in Tucson, walking amongst the saguaros, but having no clue of what the rich, abundant food source they provided. And that's just the beginning. That's just the gateway into this abundance that's here. If we can just train ourselves, re-educate ourselves to see that abundance, but not just to extract from it, but rather to give back, to have a reciprocal relationship. So one of the things Stella taught me is when you separate the red pulp of the saguaro fruit from its skin, you then put the skin back at the base of the saguaro from which you took it in order to bring back the rains. And that, I just love that idea that we can have a harvesting ethic, a harvesting practice that can also give back. And not only can we help bring back the rains, but by putting the skin that we're not going to use, the skin of the fruit, back at the base of the saguaro from which we harvested it, we're also helping recycle the organic matter, the biomass, back into the soil and the roots of that saguaro which shared its fruit. And there's so many other ways we can do this. So here we can see some of that glorious fruit, the fresh stuff on the left. On the upper right, we can see the dry form, the June, which is my favorite. And then folks in the lower right processing the fruit into syrup, jelly, wine, and more. But there's still so much more we can tap into. Here in the upper left corner, we have the desert ironwood tree blossoms. On the upper right, we have the barrel cactus fruit. It's kind of got a citrusy flavor, edible seeds. The lower right, we've got a number of edible greens along with the mammillaria or pincushion cactus fruit and desert hackberry fruits. And in the lower left, we've got the mesquite pods. We've got desert ironwood seeds, palo verde seeds, and cholla buds. So much we can tap into. And thanks to Jill Lorenzini for her photography and the beauty she captured of these foods. On this slide in the upper left, we have the cat claw. It's like the desert okra. We can utilize the fruits when green like okra. Can pickle them, do all kinds of things with them. And then the dried fruit, you can harvest the seeds like sunflower seeds. You can make fiber, as the autumn have used for the black fiber in their basketry from the devil's claw. Then we've got in the middle upper image, we've got the palo verde seeds, so the green seeds. It's like the green bean tree. There's the blue and the foothills, and then there's now the introduced Mexican palo verde. I like the foothills palo verde the best. For me, that's the tastiest. But try it out, see what you prefer. Then the upper right, we've got the blossoms of the palo verde and the tuberosa and other natives which we can top dress our salads of wild and domesticated greens. Lower right, we collaborated with, we meaning Desert Harvesters, collaborated with La Cocina, a local restaurant, and Bean Tree Farm, a local wild foods farm here in Tucson, supplied many of the wild ingredients. And they, for different events, they will incorporate it into the menu, and they're starting to incorporate some of these wild foods into their regular menu. So they've got prickly pear fruit margaritas. They've got rainwater daiquiris with creosote tincture that makes it smell like rainwater, like the desert rain, and so many other goodies. And in the middle, we've got the mesquite cornbread. And then in the lower left, we've got some wonderful 3-bean salad from Bean Tree Farm with ironwood blossom garnish, and along with cholla buds within, and so much more. So I'm just kind of really quickly going through these so you guys can just start to get kind of a flash exposure to some of the abundance that's here. And be sure to check out the Eat Mesquite and More cookbook that shows you how to plant, harvest, and utilize many of these foods. So a whole nother oasis is our once perennially flowing waterways. So the Santa Cruz River used to flow year-round through Tucson, the Gila and the Salt through Phoenix. And unfortunately, the way we have been managing our watersheds or mismanaging our watersheds, our aquifer and whatnot, we've been killing our rivers. So this is the Santa Cruz River today, basically a dry riverbed. But it doesn't need to be this way. If we changed the way we live and practice, if we enabled more of the rainfall to infiltrate and recharge the aquifer than we pump out, we could regain the river, as Phoenix could with their rivers. So here's an oasis killer, in a sense, as the Central Arizona Project. So Phoenix and Tucson are very much dependent on the Colorado River, pumped 300 miles from river to cities, and an elevation rise of over 3,000 feet if you count the elevation rise of each pump station along that canal. So the Cap Canal is the single largest consumer of electricity in the state of Arizona because water's heavy and it takes so much power to move that water. And since coal-burning power plants generate the bulk of the power, this canal then ends up being the single largest emitter of carbon in the state of Arizona. And we're pumping or extracting so much water from the Colorado River. And it's not just Phoenix and Tucson, it's much of Southern California, it's Colorado, New Mexico, it's many communities are pumping water out of the Colorado. But we're doing it at such an extent that we've basically killed the river at the downstream stretch. It no longer makes it to the Sea of Cortez, whose ecology is so dependent on those freshwater flows. So lower right photo shows you the dry riverbed near the Sea of Cortez. So that's a little depressing, and I'll just give you one more depressing thing, and then we'll go to the happy stuff, how we can turn things around to be more positive. So when we look at our typical urban watershed and suburban watershed, it looks a lot like this, where we're draining the rainwater off our roofs straight to the street and the storm drains, past the landscape, and getting rid of that free, abundant rain that falls from the sky, and then creating a lot of flood issues within our streets and elsewhere. But we can turn that problem into a solution if we use that water as a resource as opposed to a waste. And we can transform these dying mirages, these drain-like infrastructure that we see in the upper left, to more of a net sponge-like oasis that, rather than drain away the free resources that we already have, we can infiltrate, cycle, reuse them multiple times. This planet Earth has a finite amount of fresh water, but yet the planet never runs out because of our dynamic hydrologic cycle that cycles water again and again and again in so many different ways that the water is purified again and again so that it can be used for the highest, best means. So we should take note from that and try and mimic it. And here's more hope, here's more joy. It turns out that more rain falls on the city of Tucson in an average year of rainfall than all the inhabitants of Tucson consume of municipal water in a year. So more rain falls on our community a year than our community consumes of water. So we have all that we need. We don't have to have the Central Arizona Project if we change the way we manage water. And it's the same for Phoenix. Now, Phoenix currently, the average consumption of the average Phoenician, it's more than Tucson, and so right now you guys consume more water up in Phoenix than falls on Phoenix in a year. But you could still you can make great gains because you can meet all your landscape irrigation needs with the rain that falls from the sky if you choose to. And much more. So folks have recognized and tapped into the abundance of this place for thousands of years. Turns out that Tucson, Arizona has what may be the oldest continuous tradition of farming in what is now the continental United States. For over 4,000 years, people have been continuously farming the Tucson area. And in the upper left is showing some of the trincheras or contour terraces of rock below Tumamoc Hill, if you're familiar with the Tucson area, where there used to be agave plantations, but now there's edible palo verde, cholla, barrel cactus, medicinal sage, and so much more. And this is an image of some of the traditional Native American water harvesting strategies. In the upper images, we're seeing how folks would create dams of brush and whatnot, weirs basically, that would divert more of the flow into the floodplain, spreading the water out. They'd have crops. Sometimes they would plant in the waterway itself or just naturally on the floodplain. And in the lower part, we can see what they would do more in the uplands, outside of the drainages, where they'd have contour berms of rock or earth, or within, near the homes within the villages, they would have waffle gardens or sunken basin-like gardens. And now we want to get to the Desert Harvest Manifesto. So Desert Harvesters is a nonprofit organization in Tucson, and we've been around for a couple of decades and been trying to tap into and help enhance, partner with our local ecosystem, and then share what we learn, share what's shared with us. So I just want to read the manifesto real quick to give you a sense of what we're about and what we're trying to make happen in the world. Nature is a system of abundance, cycles, and efficiency. We can mimic that. Increase the fecundity of plants and their companions. Leave and invest fallen pods, leaves, and cut-up prunings as fertile mulch for animals, soil life, and trees. Say thank you for your harvest with generous actions. Turn landscapes into lifescapes and lushscapes. Give back. Reinvest. Excuse me. We live in a land of precious water. Use local, free, and gravity-fed water rather than imported, costly, and mechanically pumped waters. Therefore, plant the rain. Capture rainwater by digging basins and other earthworks. Catch rainwater runoff from roofs. Divert public street runoff into public right-of-way rain gardens. When you grow and harvest rain-irrigated desert food, you enhance our local ecosystem. Harvest nearby. Look for wild native food sources in your backyard, public rights-of-way, and urban trails. If they don't exist there, plant them. Replant and rewild the urban and suburban core. If you live in rural areas, look around. Learn what surrounds you. See the abundance. Savor it. Delight your taste buds. Be a culinary Cupid. Introduce new flavors to one another. Find new combinations of traditional wild foods. Innovate. Prickly pear borscht, anyone? Mesquite muesli? Practice place-based, place-appropriate, place-inspired fusion. We're not in Kansas anymore. Be here now. Celebrate. Give thanks to the ancestors. Make offerings for the future. Contribute to food, fertility, and water security here, now, and for your children, their children, and their children. Expand your community. Meet your fellow desert dwellers, those that have roots and flowers, those that crawl and flutter. Get to know other humans who harvest. There is so much to observe, so much to love. Invite, involve, include. So hopefully that inspires you all some and gives you a little juice. So now I want to give you some examples of how we're trying to realize the aim of the manifesto. So one is plant the rain. So this can be done in all kinds of different ways. As I lay out in my books, Rainwater Harvesting for Drylands and Beyond, we can do so very easily at no more than the cost of a shovel by creating these passive water harvesting earthworks. So here my nephew is playing in the storm water that's coming off the street and flowing into street side tree and understory basins. So basically the street irrigates the street side plantings for free by directing the runoff from the street to those basins and plantings. We've got a neighborhood forester group, which we're working with other neighborhoods to start their own neighborhood foresters groups. So here in our neighborhood, Dunbar Spring, we've been for well over 20 years been having an annual neighborhood rain and tree planting event where we first plant the rain with water harvesting earthworks, then plant the trees, and then we bring in the contractor to cut or drill a core hole through the curb so we can direct the street runoff to the street side basins. And this is an amazing thing because it literally enables people to set roots in their neighborhoods and grow with that which they've planted. And within these water harvesting earthworks, we encourage that people have 3 microclimates or 3 rain garden zones, basically the bottom, the terrace, and the top, as illustrated here. So in the bottom, you want to plant your higher water needy plants or your more water tolerant plants. And then on the terrace, the less water needy, less water tolerant, and on the top, the least water needy and the least water tolerant. So basically, you're putting right plant in right place. And also ideally in these water harvesting earthworks, they're not just receiving rain, they're also receiving runoff from adjoining hardscape surfaces, be it street, patio, pathway, or roof. And that way we turn that runoff, running off those adjacent hardscape surfaces, into run-on, which runs on to and into and infiltrates the water harvesting earthworks and their vegetation. And that is right on. So by doing that, we're able to dramatically increase the amount of available rainfall. We can increase the available rainfall by 3 times or more if the contributing runoff surface is larger than the planting space. So here's some diagrams showing you when we capture that rainfall and that runoff turned run-on. In a smaller rainfall event in the upper left, we might fill the bottom zone of the rain garden. In a bigger rain event, we might fill both the bottom and the terrace zones. And then after the storm is ended in the lower left, we see the water infiltrates into the soil. The goal of these earthworks is not to store water on the surface, but rather to infiltrate it below the surface into the root zone, so we lose less of that water to evaporation. We don't have puddles, thus we don't have mosquitoes breeding, so we help reduce the mosquito problem. And then in the lower right, we see after that water is infiltrated into the tank of the soil life, it also is then pumped up into the vegetation, basically the living pump of vegetation, where we can access that water in the form of shade, beauty, shelter, wildlife habitat, and much more. And the other great thing is the best cloud seeders, the best seeds, microscopic particles around which moisture condenses and forms clouds, is the bacteria that comes from the stomata of trees and other vegetation. So we can help generate more rainfall with more living soil cover in the form of vegetation. Wonderful cycle that way. And I want you to think like a tree and think like a plant. And a lot of people, when they make a basin, they make a very small one. And they don't realize that a typical desert tree will extend its roots to 3 times the diameter of the canopy of the tree's branches above. So when you create a water harvesting basin, think about how the roots grow. And it's very likely that the roots are going to grow from one basin to the neighboring basins, and so on. So you don't have to create massive basins. You can create numerous smaller basins to which the roots will spread and grow. And if you want, well, I'll just throw out this too. In the new editions of my rainwater harvesting books, which will be coming out later this summer, I've updated a lot of the calculations to show you, to enable you to figure out how much water you can capture in a simple water harvesting earthwork based on the runoff surface that's contributing runoff to it. And you can adequately size your basin to what you want to grow within it. You don't have to undersize or oversize. You get it just right. So here, let's get away from the illustrations to some photographs, the real life. So here my nephew is standing in the upper left on the top zone of the rain garden. Ordinarily, we'd have plantings there, but this is on a public path, so we don't there. Then in the upper right, he's standing on the terrace zone, and then in the bottom image, he's standing on the bottom in the bottom zone of the rain garden. And you get a sense of how big that particular basin is for that mesquite tree that's got a 20-foot canopy. We don't just plant or encourage people to plant rain and food-bearing native vegetation along the streets. We also want them to do it within the streets. So here in this neighborhood in the upper left, it was big sea of asphalt. We put in a traffic calming water harvesting roundabout or circle. Upper right, you can see when it was just after construction, it's capturing all that rainwater. And then the lower left, you can see a bunch of neighbors that came out to help plant the vegetation after we planted the water. And then in the lower right, you can see after the vegetation has grown, now it's one of the spots where people come out to harvest the numerous native plants, food-bearing native plants that have been planted within it. And you might see there's a little weather vane atop a crossroad sign there of Gamble's quail. And that's because the University of Arizona found that if people plant just 10 to 15% of their landscape in plants native to their spot, I don't mean native to the state, I mean native to their basin, like the Phoenix Basin or Tucson Basin, that's enough plants to reestablish the habitat to bring back Gamble's quail. So that's a weather vane of Gamble's quail atop the crossroad sign in that traffic circle as a call to and a reminder to the neighbors, hey, let's plant the natives to bring back this indigenous bird. And let's not just plant natives, but let's plant native plants that also give us food, medicine, and so much more. And here we created some chicanes or pullouts which narrow the street and protect on-street parking. So upper left is spray painted where the work's going to be done. Upper right, backhoe's digging out the dirt after the asphalt's been removed. Lower left, you can see basins there, and then after planted and after capturing rainwater in a storm, abundance is captured, abundance is being grown. And here we cut the street curbs to direct street runoff into street side basins. It turns out in Tucson, the average neighborhood street drains over 1 million gallons of rainfall per year. That's a 1 mile stretch of a neighborhood street. So that's more than enough water to freely irrigate over 400 native food-bearing trees per mile, or one tree every 25 feet on both sides of the street. So the huge potential here is in Phoenix, Tucson, elsewhere, we can, all our streets and all our public pathways can be canopied with cooling shade, food-bearing shade, if we direct the street runoff to those plantings. And we can select the ideal native species, so we're also enhancing wildlife habitat, sense of place, and generating food all in one go. By doing this in our neighborhood and many other neighborhoods are now doing this, we've inspired and influenced the city. So City of Tucson passed a Green Streets policy. So now all new city streets and those being significantly renovated must harvest at minimum a half-inch rainfall within the adjoining landscaping and in the median landscaping. So water harvesting is now required. It's a 180-degree shift from how things used to be done, where the streets would just drain 100% of the rainfall. Now we're starting to turn that around. There's also in Tucson a commercial landscape policy where all commercial properties have to harvest at least enough rainfall to meet 50% of their landscape's irrigation demand. Very easy to do with passive strategies. And here we have my nephew harvesting the cholla buds, the flower buds from the cholla cactus, growing within one of these water harvesting traffic calming chicanes. So those cholla buds, they're really high in calcium, they're delicious, and that cactus isn't just providing food for us, it's also wonderful bird nesting habitat because cats don't climb cholla cactus. And you can see in the lower right some of the native bees pollinating the cholla flower. And many times those native bees, the solitary bees, will spend the night in the flower when it closes. I love that. There's over 1,000 native solitary bee species in the Sonoran Desert, and we can help support them by replanting their food source, which is also our food source. Win-win. So in the cookbook, Eat Mesquite and More, we show you how to plant, grow, harvest, and process the cholla flower buds. So in the upper left, we're showing how you can use creosote, triangle leaf burr sage, or another plant that typically grows near the cholla. You can snap off a bundle of the leaves and stems and use as a brush to brush off the thorns before you pick. That's my favorite way of doing it, because then you actually spend more time with the plant, observing. You see more of your neighbors if you planted this in your neighborhood. But another way you can do this is you can harvest with the thorns on, and then you can cook the buds for 20 minutes, boil it, pour off the water to get rid of the oxalic acid, and then dry it on an 1/8" hardware cloth screen. And then once everything's thoroughly dry, you can brush it with a broom, and the thorns readily come off. And then in the lower right, you can make glorious dishes like cholla bud pico de gallo salsa, which we have Toka and all our Autumn friends with Toka for sharing that recipe. Oh man, it is a delight. God, I love it. And I don't know if you guys have ever heard of the Desert Rain Cafe. It used to be in Sells, Arizona. Now it closed and now is reopened in Ajo, Arizona. If you're ever there, go. Oh man, just incredible traditional foods. And I want to point out that even if you're not in Tucson, Phoenix, even if you're not in Arizona, our cookbook, Eat Mesquite and More, we basically created it to be a template for anywhere. And throughout much of the western U.S., throughout much of the Americas, there's a number of the plants, or at least the plant families, that grow in these other areas. This here is massive cholla flower buds. This is a cholla variety that grows in northern New Mexico. I'm envious of this particular cholla. Oh my God, they're huge and tasty. And we're not about just extracting, just harvesting. We're about let's make more of this. So when we have workshops, we show folks also how to take cuttings from the various cholla, ideally those that have the biggest buds or the less thorns, or in this case, the different flower colors. So we then pot up the cutting, get it to root, and then plant it throughout the neighborhood. And everyone that does the workshop goes home with potted up cuttings. So we're trying to increase the number of these plants out in the world. The idea is not to go out into the desert and harvest. The idea is to bring the abundance of the desert to you where you live, in the heart of the city, in the suburbs, wherever you are. And to bring more of that life unique to this place to your daily experience. And, you know, there's Christmas trees. People are into living Christmas trees. Nice idea. But rather than having a conifer that has nothing to do with the low desert, well, why don't we plant an evergreen desert ironwood tree? So here's my nephew in his Spider-Man outfit with our desert ironwood Christmas tree, 5-gallon. And in the right-hand image, you see him jumping up with excitement, knowing that that is going to be as big as the tree we'd planted a number of years earlier. It had been the same size. Best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago or today. And then in the very right of the image shows, again, the edible flower blossoms from the ironwood, the edible seeds. So you can harvest the green seeds and process them like edamame. And then once the seeds turn brown, you can process and enjoy them like dry roasted peanuts. The saguaro cactus. Here's my brother. My family. We moved here in 1970. We moved to Tucson. I was 3 years old, and my youngest brother there, Mark. The saguaro he's holding in that pot. That is how big the saguaro he is kissing was when we moved to Tucson. and they grew together. Initially, Mark was taller than the saguaro, but now the saguaro is taller than him. And we can plant saguaros. We give our more committed foresters a 6-inch tall saguaro to plant at their home or in the neighborhood. It's like a living totem. I like to give them to people when they get married, when they graduate, when there's a birth, when there's these key life events. So it's a time marker, and it's also a gift to future generations. And that fruit in the lower right that will be grown from that saguaro. So we're about these reciprocal relationships. We want landscapes to educate. We don't want landscapes. We want lifescapes. We want lushscapes. We want life cake, because life is what is at stake. So in the upper left, you can see the before photo. When my brother and I bought a dilapidated home and lot in central Tucson. And then in the upper right, you can see after we started planting the rain and started planting some native vegetation. In the lower left, you see 2013, how that had grown. And now we've got neighborhood kids harvesting the abundant prickly pear fruit from that. So we used to have a lot more crime in our neighborhood. There's a lot less crime now because there's more people on the streets planting, harvesting, pruning. And when there's kids giggly like that in the lower right, if they're happy with their harvest, it's really hard to commit a crime. No matter how bad a mood you are in, your mood's going to shift when you see that. It's going to shift even more if you get in on the harvest and the planting, because you're contributing. So my nephew here, he's with his buddy and his mom. This kid, he's an entrepreneur. He knows how to make some money because he creates these little prickly pear lemonade stands with mesquite cookies and bread and whatnot. And he's harvested these native ingredients from the neighborhood. So basically, he's got zero overhead with these native ingredients because he's just picking what's grown for free and that he helped plant right there in the neighborhood. All irrigated for free with rainwater and street runoff. No pumped Colorado River water, no pumped municipal water. It's all gravity-fed goodness. And here, upper image is the before, and then the below image is the after we planted rain and the food-bearing native vegetation. What a difference. And we're helping reduce flooding downstream by pulling more of the water off the street, higher in the watershed.
Hey, Brad.
Yeah.
Jump back one slide.
Okay.
That's your house, isn't it?
Yes, that it is.
That's what I thought.
Thanks for pointing that out.
Yeah.
So we started planting in 1996, and the lower image is what things were looking like in 2014. I like to start where I am. And when we started, when we created our annual neighborhood tree planting project, at that time, you could get subsidized trees from a city program, but at that time they offered no native trees. It was all exotics and many of them invasive. So it was called Trees for Tucson, but at that time kind of seemed like it was trees from someplace else as opposed to Trees for Tucson. So, but we worked with them and they're really great. They said, hey, you can create your own tree list for your neighborhood. It can be like a pilot project. So we changed the tree order form so it was only native food medicinal bearing native trees. And we figured out what those were by looking to a lot of the great ethnobotanical texts of the area, which you see in this slide, and started planting it out. And it was a huge success. And we've now Trees for Tucson offers the native trees that we created in our hybrid because they saw how well it did. People really wanted it. So you can make change right where you are. Just got to ask, just got to do. So here's a bunch of neighbors planting the rain, first creating basins, then pulling up the asphalt. Hey, there's soil below that. Delivering the trees, having a feast after the planting. And in the upper right, we've got one of the cross guards, the school, elementary school. And I asked her, I said, hey, would you be willing to water this tree after we plant, if we plant it, and after we plant it for through the first few months? And she said, no way. I said, really, why not? And she said, well, because I'm old and I'll be dead before that tree is of any decent size. And we said, okay, well, that's one way of looking at it. But you could also look at this as your legacy tree. And, think about all these kids you're helping cross across the street. Well, this tree is going to grow to provide shade for them and their kids. And they can remember you for what you did to enable this tree to grow, to get established. So it could then subsist on rainfall alone. She said, okay, I'm in. And I think that's the way we got to think about it. Let's think beyond ourselves. We couldn't exist without all this other life that supports us. Well, we can contribute back. So we don't just plant from potted plants. We also plant direct from seed after we've planted the rain. In the upper right, you can see a very small basin, really done really quick, just in 5-10 minutes. Made a basin, and then just as the summer rains were beginning, we scarified the seed with toenail clippers in the upper left, just chipped the seed coat of the foothills Palo Verde, planted the seed, and then the rains in the lower left, you can see, came and irrigated it for free. So 3 years after planting that seed, in the lower right is the image. Now that tree is as tall as me and grown just from seed. So we plant the rain where we want the tree to grow, and then we plant the seed. And that costs nothing because we're just collecting the seed from area trees. Now, I should say real quick, Palo Verdes hybridize really readily. So if you want a true foothills Palo Verde, make sure there's not Palo Brea growing around because those readily hybridize. Same thing with like mesquite. I don't plant the seed of mesquites that I find in the urban center because there's so many non-native mesquites growing here. They hybridize. So I go off into the more deep desert areas where there's not non-native mesquites growing to collect my seed that I'll plant so I can get a true native growing. And there's more info on all that stuff in Eat Mesquite More. So then we go further. We also plant fertility. So in the left, it's a nightmare scenario, not staged. That guy's literally vacuuming his yard. So he's vacuuming up the leaf drop, which is basically the nutrients. He's the sponge. Leaves are called leaves because we're supposed to leave them. So as opposed to doing that oasis depleting strategy of removing the leaves, the biomass and whatnot, we want to encourage more of that. So when we create these water harvesting basins, they don't just harvest and collect and hold water, they also collect leaf drop. So you can sweep your patio the leaves that fall on your patio into the adjoining basin. And gravity will help hold it in place. And when you prune your trees, cut up the prunings and drop them, chop and drop that biomass that will help generate a living sponge that much more rapidly infiltrates the water, slows the loss of water to evaporation, and gives you free fertility, especially in the form of these nitrogen-fixing leguminous tree leaves, such as the ironwood, the mesquite, and so on. And here in the upper left, you can see, look at that rich soil. So it was sterile soil before we started harvesting the water and harvesting that organic matter. Now it's this incredible sponge. And Mitch Pavlo-Zuckerman's done some great research at the University of Arizona. He found that in organic matter mulch basins, so street-side basins mulched with leaf drop, cut-up prunings, so on, when they were compared to street runoff harvesting basins mulched with rock, found the organic matter mulch basins had twice as much soil moisture as the rock mulch basins, even though in the study the organic matter mulch basins had a smaller catchment area. So they were even receiving less water initially, but still they held more water. And in those organically mulched basins, we had twice as much soil organic matter. I don't just mean the organic matter on top of the surface, but I mean deep into the surface and all the life forms which are part of that soil organic matter, and the roots, the arthropods, the earthworms and all that help create channels that enable water and air deeper into the soil and create more of that living sponge. And also found that this organically mulched basins sequestered far more carbon, not only in the larger, healthier vegetation, but in the soil itself. So we can collaborate with all that. And here, if you don't have a lot of room to make a street-side basin, can't go any wider, perhaps because there's underground public utilities, you can go perhaps deeper. So you can do vertical mulching, and I explain this in detail in Rainwater Harvesting for Drylands Beyond Volume 2, second edition, coming out later this summer, where we basically go deeper and then fill this mulch hole full of coarse prunings and whatnot. So you can stand on top of it when it's fully saturated with water and you won't fall in, so you can't drown. But you've got a lot more capacity, and you've also got all this much more organic matter that is then breaking down with that added moisture and building more soil and feeding more soil life. And here's a cool thing. Oh, I'm going to go back a slide that I forgot to talk about. Whoops. All that organic matter, it's great habitat for mycelium, fungi. And the root-like hairs of the fungi not only break down the wood chips and whatnot and the leaves, but they also tap into the roots of photosynthesizing plants. And that fungi gives the plants minerals and water in return for the sugars from the photosynthesizing plants. So when we've got that mycelium in the soil tapped into the roots of the plants, we can increase the surface area of the plant's roots by well over 100 times. So if you really want to get the full potential of your water harvesting earthworks, your rain gardens, you better have that soil life as well. So I want you guys to think about where you are, what plants and what foods of your place do you want to spotlight? Okay, so in the low desert of Arizona, I've mentioned a number of them. There's and in Eat Mesquite More, we talk about that. But if any of you are listening from a higher elevation area, it could be acorns, pinon nuts. It could be those bigger cholla buds. What's available where you are? If you don't know, talk to local plant freaks, geeks, and experts. Look for native plant books. Look to the ethnobotanical text of your area, and start to tap in. What's your bait? What's your gateway wild food? So a big gateway food in the low desert is mesquite. So mesquite's abundant. There's 3 native mesquite trees to southern Arizona: the screwbean mesquite, the velvet mesquite, and the honey mesquite. So the higher elevation, well, it depends. In the southeastern part of the state, it's more honey mesquite. In Tucson, Phoenix, it's velvet mesquite. We used to have a lot more screwbean mesquite when we had perennially flowing rivers in our areas, because the screwbean takes a bit more water. But either way, they're oftentimes great tasting. But here's the key thing, is every tree tastes different. So you want to taste before you pick. So go up to a tree, pull off a ripe pod. You want it ripe, so it's yellowish or reddish. It's dry enough so when you try and bend it, it snaps in two. Chew on it and you suck on it. You don't want to be breaking the seeds with your teeth, because you can't. The seeds are harder than your teeth. But just chew on the pod and taste it. See what it's like. And if you like the flavor, keep picking. If you don't like it, spit it out and go to a different tree. And the cool thing is, trees, for the most part, they'll hold on to that flavor year after year. So, but you need to know, some trees are heinous. Some trees really taste bad, while others taste great. And there's everything in between. So educate your palate. So in the lower left image, at a lot of the Desert Harvesters events, we have taste tests. So we'll go out and pre-harvest a big variety, and so people can taste some of the breadth of the palate. And the more flavors that we're aware of, the more in tune our palate becomes, and the more strategically we can harvest. I like to even harvest in batches. I'll harvest sweet and sour pods for my sweet and sour flower batch. I'll harvest sweet pods for the sweet batch. I'll harvest the nutty ones for that. There's kind of fruity flavored. There's all kinds of stuff. So tap what you like. And in the lower right, we've got the man in the middle is Clifford Pablo. I have him to thank for teaching me. So his grandfather taught him out at the San Javier reservation on how to pick the pods, as did his horses, because he and his grandfather would go out on horseback. You can harvest the higher pods that way. And the horses, they would only bother eating the sweet pods. So sometimes they just let the horse lead them, and then they pick from that. But they also have the apple-flavored tree and whatnot, and would go back to those trees year after year. So we also, and here's another key thing I want to say to you all. There's something we need to be aware of is aflatoxins. So there's a soil-based fungus that can get on the pods when we have three conditions. We have really high heat, we have ripe pods, which means sugars in those pods. And then we have moisture. If we have all three of those conditions, the chances of aflatoxin, invisible aflatoxin, being on the pod are elevated. So the best time to harvest our pods is before the summer rains, before they get wet. So if it's really hot and they're really dry, sweet pods, no problem, as long as they haven't gotten wet. And now in higher elevation areas that are cooler than the low desert, some studies have found that you can harvest after the rains. It's not as big an issue as it is in the low desert where it's hotter. But wherever you are, really the best practice is to harvest as soon as you can after the crop ripens up. So you've got a fresh crop, okay? And by planting, growing in the neighborhood, you don't have to transport yourself to get around. You're irrigating with free street runoff and rainfall, so you're not having to pay for irrigation. You don't have to buy fertilizer because the tree does it itself with that mulch and the nitrogen fixation of the tree. So we find people can make $25 an hour harvesting, milling, and then selling mesquite pods grown in the neighborhood. Don't even have to leave the neighborhood. That's pretty sweet. That's a living economy right there.
Hey, Brad.
And yeah.
I slip back to that one, would you?
Okay.
So I just want to do a shout out. We for our mill, which I'm going to talk about here in a little while, we actually bought the stainless steel part. So it is truly a food grade mill, and our mill is going to sit there about 360 days a year, doing nothing. So we would love, Grow PHX would love it if somebody in the Phoenix metropolitan area wanted to harvest beans, rent the mill to mill them, and then sell the flour. So that's part of what Grow PHX is about, is coming up with assets like this, like the mesquite bean mill. So we'd really like to chat with anybody who's interested in doing that.
Nice. And I also want to give a shout out to Grow Phoenix and for all your efforts, and that you are scheduling your mesquite milling end of June, so before the bulk of the monsoons come. That's great because you're walking the talk. So people are able to harvest early on in the season, and that's awesome. That's what we want to encourage. Make it easy for people to do the right thing.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. So here on the left-hand side, I'm sorry, in the lower right, you can see that those pods are kind of shredded. So that's from the birds. They know which are the sweeter pods, and they'll rip off strips. So a lot of times the birds lure me into the better pods. And in the left-hand side, you see I'm grabbing a nice handful of pods. So if you guys are selecting seed, especially if you're out more in the desert and you're selecting seed to grow, go for at least 3 characteristics. 1, great tasting pods. Then pre-monsoon ripening. And 3, dense pod clusters. Now you don't know who that tree cross-pollinated with, so you only know half the genetics. But you've got better odds in the lottery of getting good seed if you harvest seed from a tree having those characteristics. We need more people selecting for these things, not just ornamentation, but greater food-bearing quality. And then in the upper right, we have Wilson's warbler. So this is a neotropical songbird that migrates from Central America up to Canada and back every year. And it's a small bird, so it has to refuel along its migratory journey. So it can drop into one native mesquite tree. This does not work in a non-native mesquite tree. It can drop into a native mesquite tree, and it can increase its body weight by 10 to 20%, just 2 to 4 trees hanging out in that one tree, just eating insects, the beneficial insects in that one tree. So this just blew my mind and blew my the size of place of what I consider home, because I realized, wow, the trees I plant right outside the door, I can help these birds on their migratory journey. And this place, if I have it include their migratory route, is expanded by thousands of miles all of a sudden. So plant the right tree. So on the left, we have a non-native mesquite, a South American hybrid. On the right, we have a native velvet mesquite. And so often, these non-native mesquites blow over in storms because their root system just does not seem to be that well adapted to our soils. They're much more prone to blowing over. So you typically have much more resilient tree with the native. It's far better for the wildlife. So it turns out that a non-native mesquite tree supports about a dozen native pollinators, whereas a native mesquite tree supports over 60 native pollinators. Now, if I go to Central America, okay, if I go to South America, I'm going to want the South American native mesquites there. But here, I want the Sonoran Desert native mesquites. Okay. So, and this is a boon to the larger economy. So it turns out that watchable wildlife activities generate $1.4 billion in economic activity per year in Arizona. So let's encourage and enhance these migratory routes. And what got us going, desert harvesters going for milling mesquite? Well, first it was Clifford Pablo tuning us into how to harvest the best tasting pods. And then he started a business with the San Javier Farm Co-op where they harvest the mesquite pods and they grind it into flour. But it wasn't we didn't have access to that mill for those of us in the city. So we then heard about these folks in Cascabel, just east of Tucson on the other side of the Rincon Mountains, who they found an old mill in an old barn, and they set it up, they refurbished it, set it up, and got a belt that went from the mill, which you can see in the lower left, to a mobile home axle. And then they backed a Suzuki 4x4 onto that. And when they got the Suzuki 4x4 humming along in second gear, it got enough RPM that it was cranking that hammer mill that they could grind the mesquite pods. And it wasn't the most efficient thing. As you can see on the right, much of the flour ended up on David, who ran them. But nonetheless, it was amazing how quickly we grind the flour. So, with a hammer mill, on average, you can grind 5 gallons of whole pods into 1 1/3 gallon of flour in just 5 minutes. And this was also a real exciting event because someone had to stand with a metal bar next to that belt to ensure that it wouldn't fly off and decapitate someone. So that was great. And it was also great, in the upper left, you see Pearl there. She would head the making of mesquite pancakes and mesquite waffles with prickly pear syrup. So people at the event got to taste what these wild foods tasted like, even if it's their first time there. So we took inspiration from that and created in 2003 the first annual mesquite milling fiesta and pancake breakfast. And we have 3 griddles going. We didn't really know what we were doing, so in the right-hand image, we actually set up the mill bags incorrectly. That big bag should have been on the upper part of the ductwork, so we lost a lot of the flour. But that kid tapped in. He saw what was going on, so I don't know if you can see there, but he's hanging out with his mouth open and tongue out, and he's getting a free harvest. So later we figured it out in this image. 8 years later, in 2010, we got it right. So everything's set up right. And it was so popular, we had people lining up around the block that we had to bring in other mills. So Clifford Pablo brought in his mill. He now had a mobile mill by this time. We brought in the Cascabel folks and got people to sort out the pods. Oh, this is another thing, too, what we learned with this process, is a lot of people pick up off the ground. You don't want to pick up off the ground. You lay out a sheet first and then shake the tree and put it on the sheet, and it drops off on the sheet. Because if the pods have been sitting on the ground for a while, especially fishing around, they're going to get wet, and you're going to have that aflatoxin issue. Also, in the urban and suburban environment, a lot of people are spraying herbicides. You don't want that getting on the pods that you're going to eat. And there's more fecal matter from domestic animals and wildlife pooping. So from the tree. And we found some people would get really lazy. They would just rake up their pods, put them in the bucket, and they'd want to run it through the mill. Well, we don't want that going through the mill because that's going to contaminate other people's stuff. So we have we visually inspect the pods, make sure we don't see any black molds or other things, and make sure there's nothing other than pods in there. We've had buckets show up with screws and old Kleenex and pencils. So it's cool. It's key to inspect beforehand to make sure it's good quality stuff. And we refuse to let stuff that doesn't pass the test in. And we're educating people so that the following year they'll bring a higher quality harvest. So we have to constantly educate, and then things get better and better. So after a while, we got kind of burnt out of making pancakes. And not just burnt out, but we realized, wow, people are missing the boat. This gateway food of mesquite, we didn't want people to stop at pancakes and waffles. There's so much more you can do. So we created these community recipe tasting events with the goal of creating a cookbook. And so we provide some of the wild ingredients for people, and we said, hey, just see what you can make, and we would have these little forms next to what people would taste and say, hey, was it good, was it bad? And only the stuff that got really high ratings would make it to the next step to the cookbook. And then we would see the recipes and the items that people really liked. We'd try and get other people to make it, see if the recipe was replicable. And if so, it'd go to the next step to making it into the cookbook. And so then we stopped doing pancakes. Instead, we had bake sales. And it was so much more inclusive because so many more people could participate. So you can just see this incredible diversity of what would just show up. And we would make available. So there's mesquite baklava. There's Indian naan bread, mesquite naan bread with prickly pear chutney. There's dog biscuits and so much more. And we have a great deal of these recipes in the Eat Mesquite and More cookbook. And even go beyond that, we can also make food with what eats the mesquite, such as the pack rat. The pack rat, man, it is the sweet meat of the desert. Barbara Rose made some amazing recipes with these saguaro barbecue sauce. But we've got recipes on how you can capture and process and enjoy pack rat along with grasshoppers and other amazing things. And you can also make beer with mesquite and other wild foods. So we've teamed up with local craft brewers such as Iron John's. They've got an amazing mesquite porter, but they also make the Saison de Juki, which is infused with creosote flowers, giving it that desert rain smell. And the great thing about this is getting local businesses to incorporate the wild foods. It expands the population's exposure to these wild foods, to what's possible. And we encourage these local businesses to grow a lot of these plants at their businesses as a living billboard, and to harvest ethically. And XO Roast, a local coffee company, they make an amazing cold brew coffee that is sweetened with locally harvested and processed mesquite syrup. They also have a chiltepine cold brew, the recipe for which they have in the Eat Mesquite and More cookbook. And in XO Roast kitchen, they oftentimes have many other amazing wild food ingredients. So with the wild foods, it really takes local food to a whole nother level. Locally grown chilies are awesome, but you can get those in most any hot climate. But getting a chiltepine, a wild chili, indigenous to this place, that's going to a deeper level. And the chiltepines have mind-blowing flavor. So with work of desert harvesters and so many others, and the rich culinary traditions of the autumn, the Spanish speaking cultures and the ranchers and so much more, in December 2015, Tucson was named the first UNESCO World City of Gastronomy. And we tapped in and partnered with Edible Baja Arizona to create a year-long event where there'd be working with all these different craft brewers, and we set up a whole calendar that every other month there'd be different wild and local ingredients that they had to make beers with. And then we'd have a big public tasting event, and it'd be a fundraiser for local groups that were trying to elevate the local food security and diversity. And the great thing with this is so many more brewers now are using wild food ingredients, such as the prickly pear fruit, the mesquite pods, creosote flowers, and much more. So often what it just takes is an invitation and an opportunity to spotlight this. So Desert Harvesters also has a lot of demonstrations and workshops, hands-on workshops. We partner with the Tucson Community Food Bank, and at their farmers markets have regular wild foods demonstrations. And then upper right, you can see at Bean Tree Farm, one of the wild food harvests, which is followed up with the processing and then a feast of many of these wild foods. And here we've got images of the Neighborhood Foresters group, where after planting the rain in these trees, we found we also really need to train people up so we have more citizen foresters that know how to care for these trees. Because so often the biggest threat to our urban forests is city-hired crews, which answer a complaint call on litter or maybe a low-hanging branch blocking a road or a footpath. And all too often the crews they send in damage the tree or even cut the tree down entirely. So we're training up neighborhood residents to properly prune these themselves so trees are not damaged, but rather their health is enhanced. And then instead of carting away all the biomass that's pruned, we run it through a chipper shredder and reapply that which is pruned back as a soil amending mulch, so nothing leaves. And it's all about community. So as you're out there on the street, planting, harvesting, what have you, you meet more people, you talk to them. You educate others, or they educate you. And you know, all that we need for this abundance, it's already here. We just got to tap into it. We got to share it. We got to help collaborate with it. And the way, if you want to go about that, there's many ways you can. The Eat Mesquite More cookbook gives you many means. The rainwater harvesting for drylands and beyond books do the same. So you can go to these two websites for far more information. And I want to talk to your local libraries, ask them to carry these books. Talk to your local bookstores, ask them to carry and sell these books. And my two rainwater harvesting books, I have just completed 2 new full-color editions of these, major reworkings of these books. So they will be available later this summer. I strongly encourage you to go now to my website, harvestingrainwater.com, and pre-order these books. That will really help me more quickly pay off the debt I've incurred from spending a number of years redoing these books. Massive revision, especially volume 2. I'm just overjoyed with these books and these new editions. You know, when you first birth something, it's amazing. When you first create something, it's amazing. But it maybe takes a while to get to fully realize the vision you initially had. And these new editions, not only do they finally meet that original intention, they've exceeded it. So I can't recommend them enough. And so thanks so much.